you tugged on my heart with reminding me how much I love to travel, because I really miss that, and I look forward to the time I get to do it again. Before we get started today, we have about 45 minutes together. And I will tell you, this is the first time I've ever done this exact presentation. I made it just for you all. So I may have over prepared with slides. So we'll see how it goes. But I promise it will be done in 45 minutes. And if I'm trying to find my timer. Okay. So what I want to start off today with is a trigger warning. I always believe in giving you just due. I don't like to use images or data just for the sake of shock value. But you can't talk about trauma and you can't talk about violence without talking about trauma and talking about violence. So we are going to be digging into that today. So what I say is put yourself first. One of my mentors, Mildred Williams, one of the first things she told me when I went into social work is our passion is our pain. And I know a lot of us come into this field because we have our own personal experience with things. So if you see something or hear something that triggers you, feel free, close your camera, step away, do whatever you need to do, take a deep breath, go on a walk, but take care of yourself first. You see a black screen here on purpose. I want to start out today with a very short moment of silence to honor the life of Breonna Taylor. All right, let's get it cooking. So our journey today, we're going to talk about three things. Hopefully we're going to break them up, but we're going to end on some hope. We're going to talk about the problem. I know probably everybody in this room is already working in this world of the problem. We're going to talk about what that can create, the aftermath of it, and then hopefully we're going to end with some good news on what we can do. So what I encourage you to do, I am a social worker, I'm a therapist, I do a lot of work in the body, and it drives me crazy that I can't see how you are all responding to this information. So I'm going to trust that you'll be professionals and do it the way that you're going to best get benefit from this presentation. And to do that, I want you to start now, even where you're sitting, you may be in your bed in your pajamas. I don't know what your day looks like, but I want you to just notice what you feel in your body now. Are you feeling relaxed? Are you feeling any tension in your chest, in your shoulders? Is your jaw tight? Or are you feeling loose? Kind of get your baseline. And then I want you to notice as you see some of the images that you're going to see, some of the data that you're going to hear, does that change? Does it loosen you up? Does it get you more tight? Because as we talk about trauma, one of the things I hope you leave knowing today, if you don't already know, is that we experience it here in our body before we ever understand it here in our minds. So that's hopefully that you're going to learn a little bit about yourself as we move forward. So I'm a big believer in defining what we're going to talk about. So today I'm going to use the letters IPV a lot. Referring to intimate partner violence, that's often used interchangeably with domestic violence. So when you see IPV, just know that that's what we're talking about, okay? And it doesn't necessarily have to refer to someone who is in a living together situation. That's the reason I choose to use IPV. You can read through these. I'm not a presenter that is going to read you slides. I feel like if I did that, I could just send you the PDF version of this and you wouldn't need me here. But what I want to point out with this is you look through some of the different types of intimate partner violence. I want you to notice that, especially with those bottom two, that these kinds of incidents are not always what's going to cause wounds that we can see with our eyes like we can here on the picture on this slide. I think that's important to remember on our end as people who serve individuals who could be experiencing intimate partner violence, because very often we are serving people who have suffered things like stalking or psychological aggression and emotional harm. And they've had to go through that for years sometimes because we don't have the evidence to prove that that even happened. But they could be experiencing and suffering from wounds that are much deeper than something right here on the eye that can heal a lot easier than a psychological wound. Now I'm going to take you through some data slides. And remember what I said about noticing, because you're going to read numbers. Some of these may shock you. Some of these you may swim in this information every day more than I do. But just kind of take note to the breadth and the depth of the amount of people who actually suffer from intimate partner violence. If you work in this field already, one thing you probably already went to reading these numbers are on the right-hand side of your screen. Both are probably, but especially with males, we know that those numbers are tremendously underreported because of the stigma just about reporting when it comes to being a male and reporting. When I was doing some research for this presentation, this number right here really jumped out to me because I was like, is that one with a B? Yes, that's 1 billion total estimated children who are victims to violence each year. And as you kind of continue to dig through this, I want you to notice a theme. And I'm gonna hit on this a few times throughout the presentation. Because when I talk about intimate partner violence, especially when we talk about the trauma that can result from it, I'm going to talk about other issues. Because as you probably already know, trauma does not happen in a vacuum. It is very, very uncommon that a child could be in a home where there's intimate partner violence and not other types of trauma also going on. It is if you're familiar with the ACEs study, which we're going to talk briefly about in just a minute, it is very common that if somebody is going through intimate partner violence, there's also substance abuse in the home. There's also sexual abuse in the home. There's also physical abuse amongst different parties. A lot of times the kids may not be the first person that the aggressor is targeting, but a lot of times they could end up catching the brunt of what's going on. And this right here, it really just kind of stuck me in the gut. And I felt this in my body when I read this one, just how much more likely a child is to be exposed to, to be sexually assaulted when there is violence in the home. I recently read, I think it was probably a year ago. So I don't know if y'all are like that. When I say recently, it could have been this morning or like a year ago. So a friend of mine over at the Riley Institute sent me a national study that was done amongst high school students, and it had national numbers and then South Carolina numbers broken out beside it. And I can see this if I close my eyes, but there were different statistics that they asked among these students. And it just really jumped out at me how many kids live in a constant state of fear and not in safety every day. One of the numbers that I remember was in South Carolina, and 11.4, so over 1 out of 10 students had reported not going to school at least one time in the past month because they felt unsafe. And so I say that just to say our kids are going through this stuff too. And we have to, I think it's easy to forget, like when we live in our comfortable homes, and for the most part, we probably have lives that are pretty safe every day, but that's not always the case with our students. Shoe fly. I'm a student. I'm sorry, y'all. I live in the world of school. So if you hear me say students, just change it to whatever works for you. Client, child, whatever. All right. So now we're going to shift. I feel like the first part of that was more in your world. Now we're kind of moving more into my world as far as the trauma goes. And so again, I want to go back to defining things. We use the term trauma in a lot of different ways. It has, for good and for bad, become a very trendy kind of a term to use. And a lot of people throw it around lightly. But today we're going to talk about trauma not as an event. We're going to talk about trauma as the result of a stressful event or as the result of a long period of living in a state of chronic stress or traumatic stress like that. And why do I think that's important? I think that's important because it gives us a little bit of power and a little bit of hope back. There's a lot of research out there, and you don't have to take my word for this for anything. Please go look it up. But when it comes to our job, we can help to provide protective factors to mitigate the effects of a stressful situation, so that someone could go through a situation that we may deem traumatic, but may not come out of that with something like PTSD, which we're going to talk about, but may actually come through that with something that's now called post-traumatic growth. So I warned you, you probably see the statues in the back. We're going to do a little bit of body work right here, a somatic exercise. So first, and you can throw this in the chat. I think I have a moderator that has full reins to interrupt me and break this up if y'all have questions or comments. But even if it's just within your own mind, within your own self, I want you to just kind of take notice for a second. What have you experienced? Are there any vibes that are coming up? You getting any kind of sensations? A lot of us say that when we're around people, we can pick up on their energy. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. What are you picking up on? Now, we're going to go through a kind of unconventional exercise. All I'm going to do is show you some images. And again, I want you to kind of get settled. Notice where your feet are touching the ground. Notice where your body's touching. Take a deep breath. I trust that you are. And then just notice if you experience anything when you see these images. This one brings me great joy. I couldn't be sitting here talking to you with at least 2 cups of this today. I do see some smiles. I see some smiles. I see my panelists. That's who I'm looking at, y'all. So I know a lot of us will probably rather be here right now. Some of y'all may be. Some people may gravitate more towards something like this. What kind of vibes do you get when you see this image? I put this one here on purpose. I don't anymore. One of my roles in the school district when I first started was with the attendance department, formerly known as truancy department. So I spent some time in family court down in Greenville, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, I did that job for several years, and still coming in as a student advocate, every time I stood in front of a judge, I was a wreck. If you've ever heard, I'm fighting the urge. I want to go into a real trauma training, like a deep one, but there's a thing called the window of tolerance, and I'm going off topic here. But when we're in our window, we're okay. We're accessing our full body, our full brain. But what happens is when we get sent out of that window, either in a hyper arousal or a hypo arousal, like a fight or flight, you may have heard that term before, or even a freeze, stressful situations can send us. My kids say, you got me feeling a certain kind of way. That's what they mean. They're not using clinical terminology, but that's what they mean. And I think it's really important to be mindful and ground ourselves and remember that most of the people we work with, either them, their family, generationally, or both, have not had positive experiences in a room that looks like this. So we have to be mindful that when they are in that space, that they might not be in the same place that we are, to be able to access that level of calm and to just maybe lead with some empathy with that. Brittany, I expect a lot of people have that face that she would, if y'all can't see her, she had this. When we see a child, especially an infant that is obviously hurting, our instinct is to help. Our instinct is to feel bad. And see, you smiled. Brittany, I'm looking right at you. You're my guinea pig. So when we see a child that is happy and smiling, we often mimic that same feeling, that same facial expression. And that's because we have something called mirror neurons. I'm going somewhere with all this, I promise. It does a couple different things, but at the end of the day, this is a biological protective factor that our brains and our bodies were designed with to be able to scan our environment and to tell when we feel like someone has harmful intentions towards us. So, some of the things that we can do when we're working with folks is make sure that we check our facial expressions, that we check our tones, that we are, even if we don't feel like it, that we have to show up in our best way because we are here to serve. Because what happens is if we show up in a place like this, and y'all, I hate snakes. If I'm riding on the swamp rabbit trail and I see a snake or even a stick that looks like a snake, nope, going the other way. So, but what happens is when we see something that gives us that negative vibe, that feeling of not being safe, we cannot do our best. And I know these aren't easy to see. I experience what you're seeing here metaphorically, obviously, a lot. I feel like we work with a lot of students and a lot of clients, period, who have experienced what you just went through, that probably not to the same extent, but an up and down somatic experience through a fight, through a flight, through a freeze response, up and down what we call the polyvagal ladder, constantly. And what happens is, and if you've never seen the TED Talk by Nadine Burke Harris about adverse childhood experiences, I highly recommend it. It's about 13 minutes. and it's amazing. And I love that what she does is she gives an example of how our stress response system works. And if you're running through the forest or the woods and you see a bear, it's going to send you, right? So your body's going to go through all these experiences and all these reactions. You're going to shoot cortisol and adrenaline through your body and blah, 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 until you get away from that threat. And that's great. And the way she says it is, unless that bear comes home, unless that bear lives in your house, and then you're going to be going through that all the time. So what you just saw and what you just experienced, a lot of our families and a lot of our kids, especially if there's IPV going on in the home, that's their everyday. Yet when a lot of times when kids try to, or, you know, adult clients, when they try to explain their stories, we don't want to take that into consideration as truly a root cause of what could be going on. Now, I don't want to presume to know how easy or how hard that was for you. So real quick, let's just kind of collectively take a deep breath. And another easy grounding thing you can do to kind of come back to the moment is just simply notice where your feet are, where your hands are touching your clothes. And let's come back. So one of the reasons I took you through that is I think it's easy to talk about trauma from a cognitive sense. But again, we experience that stuff and it's stored in our bodies. And if you haven't heard of the ACEs study, if you have, I apologize. I don't want to take you through another one, but for maybe 2 or 3 minutes. The ACEs study is, to me, one of the it's called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study. And it was done in the mid to late 90s by a couple of doctors with Kaiser Permanente. And it was the first large scale study of its kind that looked at the synergetic relationship between 10 different types of stressful experiences in childhood and how they related to maladaptive outcomes behaviorally and mental health wise as adults. And the reason that was important is they were able to find a clear dose response relationship between these 10 types of childhood adverse experiences, which were like emotional abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, mental illness in the home, violence in the home, things like that. So in other words, if someone had like 3 of those things happen when they were a child, they may have had 20%, and now these numbers are arbitrary, but 20% chance of having one of these things happen, versus if they had 7 of those things happen, they might have had a 40 or 50% chance of these things happening. And that study went as deep as to where the authors and the researchers were able to posit that if someone had a score of 6, and when I say a score of 6, I mean 6 of those 10 adverse things that happen in their life, they had a 20-year less life expectancy than someone with a score of 0. So it's important to know, because what trauma does is it really affects our bodies, even if, and you may be sitting here thinking, well, obviously, if they're going to use alcohol and drugs and smoke cigarettes, they're going to get asthma. But what they found is even when those things were controlled for, that life expectancy was still that much lower. It wasn't because of the asthma. It wasn't because of the smoking cigarettes or the drug abuse. It was because of that consistent and constant elevation of the stress response system that our bodies are not designed to go through. And I come back to the point I made earlier, that trauma does not happen in a vacuum. If you're not familiar with the Children's Trust of South Carolina, I encourage you to change that today. They are, I'm not affiliated with them officially, but they do some amazing work. They offer free trainings, probably better than the one I'm doing right now. I'm going to give you a shout out to the Children's Trust. But they have done a lot of follow-up work around the concept of adverse childhood experiences. And with that, they replicated the study in our state. And this is a figure that really just drives home what I was saying, that out of all the people that responded that said they had experienced at least one of those 10 things, that almost every one of them said they had experienced more than one. So again, I want you to remember that if a child is experiencing intimate partner violence in the home, there's almost a guarantee, I'd bet money that mattered to me, that they're experiencing more than one. And another thing to point out about if you are new to this study and you go and research it after this training or whenever, it is not the end all be all. The 10 things that they mention in this study are 10 types of things that could lead to trauma. They are not the only 10. Some of the limitations of the study that have been expanded on now, they don't include things like living in living in America as a minority, as somebody who is LGBTQ plus, experiencing microaggressions every day, being homeless, things like that. So keep those in mind. So, all right, so I gave you some specifics. Now I'm going to kind of get more like 50,000 feet in the air with you, because I really pull from the work of Judith Herman, and she wrote a book called Trauma and Recovery. And to me, it's one of the most important works around trauma. And in that book, she mentions these 3 areas as probably the primary things that are affected in our life and in our bodies when we experience trauma. So number 1 is the foundational ability to feel safe in our environment, to feel connected, to feel safe with other people. And the earlier that happens, the harder it is. Because if you can imagine, especially if there's any of y'all that are parents that have newborns now, or, obviously if you're a parent, you've had a newborn at some point. When your child is a baby and they are crying, they're really trying to communicate a few basic needs. They're either hungry, tired, need to be changed, something like that. Well, what happens at that early age is if a caregiver comes to meet that need, that baby is forming a framework right then. Is this world safe? Are my needs going to get met? Or is it unsafe? Do I have to fend for myself? And that attachment is going to affect every relationship they have for the rest of their lives. It's one of the reasons early childhood intervention is so important. But at the end of the day, if you have grown up in an environment of extreme traumatic experiences, your baseline framework for the world is that it is not safe. There's parts of your brain that grow larger that are designed to scan your environment for threat, and that is going to become your default also. So if you know somebody, some of us combat vets are like that walk around on high alert, very hyper alert, hyper aroused. And that's why it's like we have been trained to scan the environment for threat. Just keep that in mind. The second one is the ability to feel power over your environment and power over your own body, depending on what kinds of things you've happened. That's important to remember. And also control. To feel like, if you've ever had like Psych 101, you've probably heard that term, locus of control. Having the ability or the feeling like I have a say, I have some power and control in my destiny. What I do matters. You may have worked with people who are on the other end of this, and maybe this gives you a new lens for it, but they feel like no matter what I do, it doesn't matter. This world's not for me. And sometimes they're rightful in feeling like that because of the way they've been treated, which is another point about trauma, is that if you have somebody who have developed these behaviors, maybe they are what we call non-compliant. They don't want to do the treatment plans. They don't want to do this, that, and the third because they don't feel like it matters. If you can one of the things I like to tell educators when I'm working with them is I don't ever want you to hear this information. And I love how y'all, I think y'all can see what I'm pointing at. I'm pointing at my slide, but don't read it or hear this and think, well, people should be able to do whatever they want. We're going to excuse it. We have to hold high standards, and we want to empower people to do better. But if you can lead in a situation where you don't understand how your client is behaving, if you can lead with the question of curiosity of not what's wrong with you, but instead lead with what might have happened to you, it will change your practice. It will allow you to lead with more empathy and more kindness and more understanding. And if nothing else, even if you don't create a solution, you won't create harm. So what we want to do is keep these 3 main factors in mind, because when whether it's your independent interpersonal practice, or if we're looking at systems level work and programs, we want to build in a way that gives these things back. We want to give back safety. We want to rebuild connection. We want to give back power, and we want to give back control. Another thing that you've probably experienced, whether you call it trauma bonding or Stockholm syndrome or something like that, a lot of the kids that grow up in a situation with intimate partner violence in the home develop a trauma bond with the offending parent or the offending adult. And why is that? What happens is there's a thing called the cycle of abuse. And a lot of times in an environment where you have one parent who is, you know, the abuser, and one parent who is more of the submissive and the victim, you know what, let me go to this next one. You could have a child, if you can picture this child and they're sitting there, and the same parent that comes in and abuses, let's just use dad as the abuser and mom as the victim, just for argument's sake here. Dad comes in and he's upset because mom doesn't have dinner on the table. And he beats mom. She's out of commission. She goes in the bedroom. But then also they're hungry, right? So dad orders some DoorDash or goes out and gets some takeout, takes kid to get pizza. And so in that dynamic, dad is the abuser, but also the protective parent and also the providing parent. For a young child, that is incredibly, incredibly confusing. And so there's this cognitive dissonance that's going on, because it's like, well, I know that it's wrong what he's doing. I don't like the way I feel when he's hitting mom, but also he's putting food on the table and he's hugging me and he's loving me. And then dad apologizes, and you go through this vicious cycle. And so sometimes what happens, even not even on purpose, unconsciously, is that child may adopt even some of those abusive behaviors to kind of make sense of that dissonance, to make sense of that guilt, to make sense of that confusion. And how does this play out in our world? Sometimes you might see generational cases. I'm sure if you've been in this game for a while, maybe in different roles even, you've served the kids of people that you served their parents, maybe even grandkids. I know plenty of people in the schools who are like, I remember when your grandmama was in this school. I mean, when your mama was in this school. And again, please don't take this as me excusing any abusive behavior, but I think we have to understand we can't really solve a problem until we understand some of the dynamics that go along with it. So if you're creating treatment protocols, sometimes don't leave out the person who has been designated as the abuser. One of my favorite quotes and I believe this came from Dr. Felitti or Dr. Anda from the ACEs study, is they say one of the more powerful things that they've learned is what is predictable is preventable. And that's one of the first things that I noticed, or that came up to me when I read this quote. You read through it and a lot of things jump out at you. You know, it's obvious that kids who are exposed to domestic violence are going to have problems in school. They're going to have problems probably with standardized tests. They're going to get frustrated. We can play this tape all the way through. They're going to get frustrated with school. They're going to end up in your courts for truancy, all these different things, behavior problems. But what I put in yellow, and it's black and yellow, go Steelers. The earlier that we can get involved in this, you all, the better of a chance that we have to prevent everything you're reading at the beginning. So we have to do good with early intervention. I mentioned earlier that I'm a combat vet. I wish, usually this is the time where I'd say, do I have any other veterans in the room? So if I do, thank you for your service. But one of the things I feel like is a tremendous disservice to the children and the people and the adults that we serve is, as veterans, we get a lifetime pass for PTSD. We do. If I did something stupid tomorrow, I may not get away with it, but I could at least get some compassion from everybody in this room by saying I was in Iraq. It's a fact. However, there's a lot of data out there, and you can find probably studies that back this up and contradict it. That's the way numbers work. But there's a lot of data that say that children who go through traumatic events suffer PTSD at a higher rate than combat vets. People who are victims of sexual assault experience PTSD at a higher rate than combat vets. And we're learning more through Stephen Porges' work with the polyvagal theory and the difference in a fight-flight response versus a freeze response. That's a whole nother training about why that is and how PTSD can even look different based on the type of experience you went through. But what I would ask is not to remove the compassion that we have for combat veterans or any kind of veteran, but let's extend that to people who have been through other situations. I enlisted on purpose. I was an adult. I made a choice. Kids don't get to make a choice and enlist in the family they want. So when they come through that, let's at least maybe kind of have a little bit of understanding that some of the behaviors that they may be exhibiting are actually protective. They're actually survival techniques. Most of you have probably, if you don't know a vet, if you're not a vet, you've probably seen movies like, what's the one with Bradley Cooper that I'm thinking about? The one where he played the sniper in the American Sniper. And there's a scene in that movie where he's driving down the road, fresh out of a deployment, but he's home, and he sees like a box or a paper bag in the road, and he has a traumatic triggering event reaction, and he swerves and he almost hits another car. And I think most of us are able pretty quickly to put two and two together and understand, all right, that's a behavior that he developed, even unintentionally, in combat to protect him from an IED. I want you to understand that there's a lot of people, a lot of adults and kids that are going to do behaviors that you don't like and that you don't understand, that when they developed them was to keep them safe in a very unsafe and a very unnatural situation and environment. And when those are transferred into our world, biology sometimes collides with social expectations. And it's our job to meet that with understanding and to maybe help them develop some new, more adaptive skills, but not just to demonize them for the ones they already have. Because you cannot punish trauma out of someone. Taking this a little bit deeper even, if a child is experiencing very, very complex, hard, really, or extended amounts of trauma, specifically from someone who is their primary caregiver, they can develop a little bit more of a complex form of PTSD. And these are some of the additional or maybe elevated types of symptoms that they can experience. The risky behaviors, we all know that, the negative self-image. And sometimes, these can go very hand in hand. We like to say, oh, they're doing this or doing that. But a lot of times we see the risky behavior because of the negative self-image. We might not see that negative self-image. But I know, especially like when working with young boys, teenage boys in class, a lot of them, if they're having struggles academically, would rather act out. They would rather be seen as the troublemaker or the funny guy than someone who can't read. So sometimes that's how that plays out. Dissociation, we're not going to dig into that one. Interpersonal disturbance, that's really just a fancy way of saying they have a really hard time making, informing, and keeping healthy relationships. So, one of the things I'll kind of throw out there is if you're having a client that you just seem to cannot get through to, it's like they just have a lot of stuff that maybe sends you, you're noticing some kind of countertransference or feelings that they're drawing up in you. A lot of times the people that are having the hardest time making relationships are the ones that need it the most. And I'll go back to the ACEs study again. What those researchers found is that the number one way, the number one intervention to help someone who is trying to recover from trauma is the presence of one healthy adult, the consistent presence of one healthy adult in their life. So believe it or not, no pressure here, but you are probably the most important person in one of your clients' lives, at least. You might not even know that, but it's an honor and a privilege and also a burden, but sometimes we carry that. And then extreme dysregulation. What I mean by dysregulation, earlier I said that about having that window of tolerance when we're kind of here. If you feel safe, you're in that window, you're good. You can sit here and listen to somebody like me talk about trauma for 45 minutes. But if you're not, you're probably not in that place. And this is maybe my favorite quote, and I'm gonna let you read it real quick. And Brittany, I have completely lost track of time, so if you'll give me like a 5-minute thing before I'm. So to put this simply, if when I say dysregulated, I mean either like up here or down here. So if I'm jacked up and you come into my space and you jacked up too, I can't help you get okay. I can't help you calm if I'm not calm. I can't help you get in your space where you need to be. That's a promise. I got one more promise. It's probably the only two promises I'll make, is that if I'm jacked up and you come into my space and you're all right, I can pull you right along with me. And if you go back to the pictures of the baby, I didn't even have to give you a prompt. More than likely, when you saw that baby who was really upset, you probably got upset too. When you saw that baby who was smiling and happy and laughing, you probably did too. I just smiled just unintentionally, just thinking about the photo. It's the way we work. Epigenetics, I will flat out say I am not qualified to go deep on this subject. I hope I am one day. This is still, in the big scheme of things, a fairly new point of study. To my understanding, epigenetics was first really started to kind of be looked at in the world of trauma with studies around Holocaust survivors. And what researchers were finding was that when you looked at individuals who had experienced a concentration camp, come through the Holocaust and survived it, their DNA was actually changed in the way it was expressed to have resilience from that trauma. But it was because of the situation. And what happened is when they studied, they actually looked at some of the DNA markers in their survivors. I mean, sorry, in their kids and their kids. And even if those people had not been through anything, well, obviously anything close, but had not really been through a traumatic experience, they shared a lot of those same DNA markers. And the marker, it's not saying that they were born with that DNA where it was obviously they were going to experience some of those same things and have some of those maladaptive behaviors, but it's almost like they were born with like a little switch, if you can imagine that. And there's some good TED Talks around this too, on those DNA pieces. And depending on what happened in their environment, it could be activated or deactivated. And I say all that to say, again, let's come back to generational. We serve families. A lot of the folks that we serve, especially, and I think we got people from all over the state, but I know here in the upstate, a lot of the folks we serve have been victims of generational trauma and generational poverty. If you're not familiar with the On-Track Economic Mobility Study, I would recommend looking at that because it really gives us a good picture of how many folks that we have who are in generational poverty.
TJ?
Yes.
Sorry, this is Julie. I wanted to point out a couple of questions that had come up in the chat. First, Tara McLean asked, are there trauma-informed guidelines for law enforcement and the justice system, and/or what suggestions do you have for law enforcement and the justice system to become more trauma-informed? And then there's one more after that one.
So that's where I'm going on my next slide. And I just checked my time and realized how behind I am. So we're gonna get to the what can we do very next. Is there another question you wanted to go ahead and ask?
Oh, sure. Also, Natasha, Natasha Pauling was asking for information on a list of local therapists who might be able to provide an evaluation if a child is experiencing PTSD.
Okay.
So just a list of resources there.
So I'm going to go ahead and preemptively apologize for how quickly I'm going to move through the last part of this presentation. I am upset with myself at not keeping good track of time. But the list of therapists, can we work together to put a list together after the training, and then you could email it out to attendees?
Yeah, I think that's a great idea.
All right. So what can we do? The main thing where I want you to start is by listening. And by listening, that means that we do this. So when we have to intentionally bring in people who have been survivors or victims of intimate partner violence, and we need to get their voice on purpose when we develop our programs. We talked earlier about losing power from experiencing trauma. So we want to build that in. We want to share power with them. One of the things that show up in the research is that a lot of times victims want services that also serve the entire family, that also serve someone that we label as an offender or an abuser. But we sometimes, as providers, we feel like we know better, and there's a big disconnect there sometimes. So that's one trauma-informed principle that you can use in your practice going forward. Authenticity, just show up and be yourself. Don't try to be someone you're not. You know, three principles I use in therapy are unconditional positive regard, really trying to, be accurate empathy, ask questions along the way to check in to make sure you're there, and just be genuine. If anybody can pick up on when you're being disingenuous, it's a survivor of trauma. Individualized services, we have to do a better job at being culturally competent, culturally curious is a word I like to use, asking someone, what does this mean in your world? What does this mean in your family? What does this mean in your culture? And trying to build that into the way that we serve them. And then we're going to talk about systems advocacy in a minute. This is something that actually a personal friend of mine who grew up, she's like the definition of somebody we would serve. And she just told me that she wished that there would have been at least one adult that was a consistent part of the system in her life that she could just talk to. Brene Brown is one of my favorite humans in the world, and she put this out into the universe, and I use it every day, and it's a practice. I'm not always perfect at it, but just trying to assume that someone is doing their best will change the way you interact with them. I have nothing I can add to that. So I mentioned Safe Harbor. We have Safe Harbor in the room. I stole this from your website, so thank you for it. When you're working with a survivor of IPV, just simply, work through these things. Again, listen, very underrated step. Believe them that they are going through what they're telling you they are. Offer support and then get them connected with people and programs in the community. And again, the most powerful thing that we can do, and I think this is Bessel van der Kolk he wrote The Body Keeps the Score. Highly, highly, highly recommend that book. We have to work backwards, and I think not work backwards, but start at the beginning. And the earlier we can get with our clients and start building programs, specifically like parenting training programs. I never have understood, like, being a parent is the one skill in the world that we think just because you become that thing, you know how to do it. Like, if you gave me a race car, I would not know how to change, do work on and maintain. I don't even know how to say what I'm trying to say. I would not know how to maintain that NASCAR vehicle. But if somebody gets a child, we think they know how to be a parent. We have to do a better job of teaching that parent how to parent and let them form that attachment and help them to do it. And as we're doing these things, in my experience, one of the biggest barriers, other than transportation, is actually being able to care for their kids sometimes when they're getting the service. I've offered services that are existing in our program to a lot of parents that we work with, especially teen parents. And they're like, well, who's going to keep my kid? Because the program doesn't allow children in the program. Children on site. So we have to think about, like, does that really make sense? And, I mentioned earlier, actually maybe working with some of the people who we label as offenders and trying to recuperate them and rehabilitate them. Like, do we really want them to be better? Like, whose needs are we meeting? Are we meeting our needs? Or are we meeting their needs? And we know that intimate partner violence is highly correlated with, mental health problems, with substance abuse. So doing a better job to provide those services as well. I firmly believe this quote, systems produce the results that they are designed to produce. So going back to Nadine Burke-Harris, the quote she said earlier, in the TED Talk that I quoted, she said when she was learning to be a pediatrician, she was in her residency. They said, if you were in a village and you're treating 100 kids a day for stomach problems, and you learn that they're drinking out of the same well, you can keep writing those prescriptions for antibiotics, or you can fix that damn well. And we keep writing prescriptions. We keep trying to we're interventioned out. And at some point, we have to collectively work together to change some of these systems that are creating these problems. And I know I don't have a lot of time, and I apologize, but some of the workers that could use some more help are us, are people who work with the kids. You know, a lot of times I don't have to tell people in this room that folks are underpaid, overworked, a lot of times underqualified to do this work. So if we really believe in the importance of this work, then we have to advocate to get things better funded, to get higher quality workers that are higher paid and with a workload that's manageable. Because as this study showed, a lot of times because of different reasons like that, intimate partner violence is simply overlooked. In the classroom, we need a whole lot more help. These are just some recommendations from a study that was done this year. In one study that was done around IPV victims in the court system, you know, victims in that study simply said just being more aware and more empowered through knowing what their rights were. Again, I think this comes back to always, and I say we, checking our assumptions and reminding ourselves that we do this work every day. So there's so many policies and words and procedures that are just commonplace that we can roll through, but we have to remember that for a lot of these people, not only is this brand new to them, but they're trying to experience it for the first time in a very elevated level of stress. And it might take a lot more patience, it might take a lot more work on our part, but that's how we can help empower these victims. I hate myself right now for breezing through the most important part. I'm going to give you my contact information in a minute. Can you say keep going? No, I don't. I like honoring people's time. But anyway, so I'm going to give you my contact information on the next 2 slides from now. But so and I wouldn't say this if I didn't mean it. If anybody has any follow-up questions, if you have any personal conversation you want to have, please feel free to reach out to me. I believe that we do this work together, and I want to do great with you all. But these are my recommendations, and I was corny enough to make them like kind of rhyme at the end. But I want you to meditate. And I don't mean you have to necessarily, like I do, sit with a seated meditation practice, although it will literally change your brain for the better. Whether it's prayer, whether it's working in your garden, find a place where you can, on purpose, be quiet and be present. Because what happens is, when I talked about being regulated, that is not something that you do when it's time. That is something you build. You wouldn't go tomorrow and try to run a marathon if you don't run now. I hope not. The same thing is true when it comes to being a regulated, calm person. Oh my God, one of my favorite stories is about Gandhi. A mom brought her young child to Gandhi one time and said, I want you to give him a lecture on why he shouldn't be eating sweets. And because he didn't need to be doing it. So Gandhi thought about it for a minute and he said, okay, here's what I want you to do. Go home, bring him back in 2 weeks, and we'll do it. So the mom does, she takes the kid home, brings him back in 2 weeks, and Gandhi gives him this articulate lecture on why he should not be eating sweets. And the kid is sold. And the mom, sends the kid away and she says, I'm curious, why didn't you do this 2 weeks ago? And he said, because 2 weeks ago I was eating sweets. We can't expect our clients to be something we're not. We can't hold them to a higher standard. So we have to engage with them in a calm and regulated body. And meditation, mindfulness, prayer, that's how you're going to get there. Communicate not just with your clients clearly, but in this room. There's over 200 people in this room making up different disciplines. And I believe that if we had a better cross-sectional, cross-disciplinary communication system, not only could we lower the amount of duplicated work that we do, but we could be more efficient and more effective in the work that we are doing. Evaluation. We cannot be scared to evaluate what we're doing. I know it's scary sometimes because you don't want to sometimes, believe it or not, or admit it or not, we don't want to know that maybe I'm not being as effective as I really think. But again, I go back to whose needs are we meeting if we skip the evaluation phase of all the work we're doing. And we have to answer, what are we really trying to accomplish, and work that into our evaluation system. And lastly, the one that is probably the least sexy to talk about is to advocate. And that comes in the voting booth, that comes in how and when and where we speak up. And this part is not convenient, because if it's convenient, then you're not advocating, you're just being. And so you have to really kind of look inward and think, all right, what are my true core values and what am I really trying to achieve in this world? And how can I advocate, and who can I advocate with to make sure I get this done? And sometimes that means putting our own personal needs second. And lastly, I knew I wasn't going to get through all this in 45 minutes, but One of my favorite movies, and if y'all have seen it, I'm proud because it's not very popular. It's called Cloud Atlas. If you want to watch it and you haven't, do like this, because spoiler alert. At the end of that movie, one of the characters he's a young man, and he's grown up in a home that is like 1800s, and he's a slave trader. His dad was a slave trader. Probably his whole family was a slave trader. And he has an experience with a slave that changed his life. And he decided, I'm leaving this world. I'm leaving this life of slave trading, and I'm going to go north and become an abolitionist. And oh, I love this scene. And he goes and he breaks the news to his dad or his father-in-law. And he says, we're going up north and we're going to become abolitionists. And his father-in-law just reams him a new one. And, he just goes off and he's cussing at him. And he said, I don't know why you think you would do this. At best, you're going to be spat on. You're going to be ridiculed. And at worst, and at best, what you do is going to accomplish what? Maybe a drop in the ocean. The guy thinks about it and he looks back at him and he said, yeah, but what is the ocean but a multitude of drops? That's what I want to leave you here with today. This is a big system. This is a big problem that we're dealing with. But I'm an idealist, and I do believe that everything we do, everything you do is a drop, but a big drop in this ocean. And the more we do together, the more we can change that whole body of water. And I'm honored to serve with you all. I wish I had more time with you. I hope I can do this with you again. This is my contact information if you want to reach out to me. Thank you for being patient with me. I hope you took something from today, and I'm going to hand it back over to Brittany.